We are all gifted storytellers. And I don't say that because I'm in a room full of media professionals. I say it because as human beings, it comes naturally. We do it by instinct. When you go home tonight, your roommate, or your significant other, or your spouse, or your child asks you, how was your day? You're not just going to list off, got out of bed, had breakfast, brushed my teeth, walked out the door, got in my car, drove to work. You don't do this chronological order of facts. You pick the weirdest or the funniest or the most interesting thing that happened, and you just rattle off a story. You don't have to sit back and outline it in your head. You don't have to come up with the premise or storyboard it. You just weave a tale, because we've been doing it all our lives. And we've been doing this for generations. Stories are part of the human condition because we use them to survive, we use them to warn people of danger, we use them to share experiences and to convince other people and entertain each other. So we've had lots of practice telling stories. Now on top of that, we work in media, we work for print publications, we work for broadcast, we work on social media. So we have experience in telling stories to wider audiences. But what I want to focus on is the power of digital storytelling. How do you take the skills that you have as a storyteller, your natural skills plus the skills that you've earned over the years, and translate that to the online world? By doing so, you can reach bigger audiences, you can have better interaction, you can help grow your companies and your organizations. So as Meredith mentioned, my name is Kwon. I'm a communication consultant here in Birmingham. I run the Y'all Connect conference. It's my pleasure to be back here at Alabama Media Professionals, so thank you for having me this afternoon. If you have questions, just raise your hand. If you have to take questions throughout, you don't have to save them for the end. And you're welcome to share any and all this presentation on social media. I'll just be talking, no slides or anything. If you want to tag me on Twitter, my Twitter name's @WadeOnTweets. If you stick around to the end, I've got copies of the outline and links to additional resources on storytelling. I was just telling them here about one of the books that I've read on sales. But I've got that and the video and other free resources, so I'll tell you how to get those at the end, plus I'll have a door prize to give out. We're going to look at three different areas of digital storytelling. How to define what your story is, and then how to tell it, because you've got so many options, and then how to monetize it. How to go beyond just the default thinking of where revenue comes from online. Before we get into that, why is it so important that we talk about digital storytelling? I just told you that we all know how to tell stories. I worked in print journalism for a long period of time. I worked at the Post-Herald, I worked at Southern Living, freelanced. So, I'm comfortable writing for publications. But what's so important about writing for websites or blogs or social media? Well, for starters, I mentioned there's that untapped audience out there. They're just not being reached. You have a generation of folks that aren't seeing publications as part of their daily routine. And so how do we reach people who do want to be involved in their community and want to learn more and understand the world around them? It's our responsibility as professionals to meet the audience where they are, to get them the information in formats that they recognize, that they interact with. And in digital storytelling, we're not talking about you got to learn all this brand new stuff. We're talking about a slight tweak of your skills and your focus to be able to reach this audience. But in this untapped audience out there, there's this opportunity to grow your readership, to grow your sales, to have this new audience that you're probably not going to be able to reach through traditional media. The other thing that is interesting about the digital world is there are a lot of numbers attached to it. There's metrics, there's site analytics, and so on, and that's valuable stuff. I worked at newspapers and magazines, so I had access to circulation figures and newsstand sales and single copy sales, but that only gave me a rough idea as to who was reading. I didn't necessarily have a sense of the demographics. I certainly didn't know what stories or headlines or photos or sections caught their eye. And that's important to know. But in digital, you know what people click on, you know how much time they spend on your site, sometimes you get demographics attached to it, and that's data that you can act on. That is data that you can use to refine your content, to tell better stories, to help your audience because you understand them better, because you're getting feedback on what they think is important, what they're actually reading, what they're actually spending time with. So those are just a couple of the reasons why taking advantage of digital storytelling makes sense. Again, with just this slight adjustment, you can reach a much wider audience. But starting out, you want to be able to tell your story effectively. So you got to define it. What is your brand story? What is the story of your company or your organization? I worked at the Post-Herald. By the time I got there, I'd been around 50 years. When I got to Southern Living, they'd been there 40 years. They had well-defined stories. The readers knew what that story was. The editors and writers and photographers knew it. The advertisers certainly knew it. Folks all across the organization beyond understood these stories. Really, my only goal at that point was to just figure out how I can help write the next chapter. How can I contribute to this grand story? But I've worked on startups and I've worked with people who are entrepreneurs, and they're struggling a little bit with the story part because they're so brand new. I mean, they're barely in existence, and how do they tell the story of an organization that doesn't have an end to the story, not even a middle to the story? And it's okay to tell that story as it goes along. You can bring the audience along for the ride, because the alternative is you're silent. You have nothing to share with your audience. You have no story to draw them in. But not all of us have the luxury of working for an organization that's been around for decades. When you join an organization and you're just learning the story, they may be just learning it too. But the interesting part is there's always going to be twists and turns, and no matter how well they plan out that story, there are surprises and shocks for them and for their audience. But telling that story is fairly easy once you get to know the organization. But it's important that you're able to tell it in a compact format. We mentioned Y'all Connect earlier. That's the digital marketing conference I put on. And I can tell you reams about that because I started in 2013. I've worked on it. I know every bump and turn in that story. But I also need a short way to share it. In the newsroom that I worked in for the newspaper, we had a writing coach. His name was Clark Stallworth. He had been with the paper a long time. He was an editor. He was a writer. He was very experienced. But he was also kind enough to share his insights on writing with me and with other editors and reporters. So he'd sit a reporter down and have them, the reporter had their notes and their tapes and their interviews all ready to go. And before that reporter wrote his story, Clark would have him do this exercise. He'd have him type out on that blank screen what the story would be in one sentence. It's almost like the reporter was like talking on the phone to a friend casually and just telling him what he was going to work on this afternoon. So let's say that reporter had just come back from City Hall covering a city council meeting, and so he'd think about it, and he might write out a sentence like, City Council to decide downtown zoning on additional businesses. That's extremely straightforward. I mean, any person will know what that story's about the moment they read that sentence. And if they want to read further, they know what they're getting. If they don't want to read further, they already know what the gist of that story is. I mean, it's practically the headline. That exercise is valuable for the reporter because from that point forward, as the reporter writes the story, he knows exactly what goes in it and what should stay out of it. And so that saves on editing time. That saves on extraneous information that might find its way into the story if the reporter didn't focus on it ahead of time and define what that story is. That's an exercise that we can apply to our own companies and that story that's out there. Think about what your company's story is and get it down to a single sentence. I mentioned that I can talk about Y'all Connect all day long, but if I were to put it in one sentence, it'd be something like, Y'all Connect is a conference in Birmingham that gives practical takeaways in digital marketing. You instantly understand what the story is. If that's something you're interested in, you can pursue it further. If that's something you're not interested in, you can move on. But I mean, it's shorter than an elevator pitch. It's easy for people to grasp. And it gives them a hook so that if they want to get more information, they can. If they don't, that's fine too. Part of the thing about digital storytelling is not just attracting a wide audience, but attracting the correct audience and keeping at arm's length the audience that has no interest in your products or your services or your company whatsoever. Beyond that writing exercise, Clark had a different, more extreme version of it, which is he'd sit down with that reporter and he'd say, don't just sum up your story in one sentence, sum it up in one word. It can be a noun or an adjective. Give me the essence of that story in one word. And so that reporter, he's working on that council story, he might boil it down to development or zoning, might even label it progress. But there's a way to capture what that story's about in a word. Right? Again, if I took my example of our conference, Y'all Connect is a conference in Birmingham that gives practical takeaways in digital marketing. If I get that down to a word, I could use marketing, I could use training, I could even use service because we place a big emphasis on customer service. At some point, I want you to take your own company story and not just boil it down to its essence in one sentence, but in a word. I'll give you an exercise to try just to get a better handle on it. By show of hands, how many of you have read the Bible? Okay, so Old Testament, New Testament, let's talk about the New Testament. If an alien landed on Earth right now and found that the Bible was one of the most widely read books on planet Earth and wanted to understand it better, so he wanders into this session and he asks you to tell him the story of the New Testament in one word. What word would you choose?
Jesus.
Jesus?
Redemption.
Redemption?
Salvation.
Grace, salvation. See, these are excellent examples. Love. You've taken a story that's thousands of words long, and you've been able to put it down into the essence of one word. Love, Jesus, redemption, grace, salvation. This person who's never been on planet Earth now has at least some understanding of what makes this testament so compelling, this part of the Bible. And that is the same editorial skill that I want you to apply to your own company's story. Now, why is it so important to get it so compact? It's not just because we're dealing with shorter attention spans. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the next section. But in telling your brand story, you've got to define it. And it's easy to do if you've been in an organization that's been around a while. It's tougher if it's new, but you can still tell that story as it comes to life. But if you do these exercises, creating that one sentence and that one word summary of your story, it's going to pay off dividends in telling it. How to tell it is the next challenge. And there are three facets that you can focus on so that you can tell that story more effectively. Those facets are channel, voice, and brand. And we'll talk about each of those. Channel is self-explanatory. There are lots of channels that we tell our stories on now. It might be a magazine or a newspaper or a newsletter, it might be direct mail, it might be TV broadcast, it might be radio broadcast, it might be events, it might be brochures. Digital gives you a lot more options, and those options are expanding all the time. You've got your websites and your blogs, you have social media, which has hundreds of channels, you have video, you have email. I mean, these are all tools that we can use to communicate our stories, our marketing messages, and so on. We can interact with people, we can share things, people can communicate with us in the same fashion. But how do you tell a story that you would tell, in 800 words in print or in 3 minutes on television? How do you tell that in Twitter I'm a big fan of Twitter. I've been using it for a few years. But each tweet's only 140 characters. That's like 1 or 2 sentences. How do you tell a story of a company or a brand on Twitter? I use it for Y'all Connect, and if I were to estimate over the course of a year, I got to figure out how many tweets would it take to tell that story adequately. And I think it'd take about 10,000 tweets. That seems like a lot. You put it in one document, and that's probably a novel. If I sat down to write that, it'd probably take me a week to write it. It'd probably take you a day to read it. But writing it over the course of a year, that's another matter. But the challenge isn't just writing it and broadcasting it. The challenge is who's reading it and following it. If people follow the Y'all Connect Twitter account, they're not going to see all 10,000 tweets. That's just not how it works. They'll see bits and pieces here and there. If I'm lucky, they'll see 1%. 1% of 10,000 tweets, that's 100 tweets. 2 tweets a week. That means if you follow the Y'all Connect account, you get to see a tweet maybe tomorrow afternoon and Monday morning. And someone else in the room who's following it might see a tweet on Friday at lunchtime and next Wednesday. How do you construct a coherent narrative when everybody's coming in at random points in your story and doesn't see every bit and piece of it? If you sit down with a book from this library, you read it from beginning to end. You don't jump to every 100th word and try and make sense of it. You don't start in the middle chapter and then read the 15th chapter and then read the 2nd chapter and then stop. And this is the challenge for us as storytellers in this imperfect medium. One thing you can do is to make sure that every tweet is infused with the essence of what your brand and your story is all about. Those tweets from Y'all Connect have to reflect that one sentence. Y'all Connect is a conference in Birmingham that offers practical takeaways in digital marketing. So that when people read a handful of tweets, they understand, oh, this is a conference. It's not a webinar. It's not a book. It's not a series of DVDs. It's an event that I can go to. They need to understand it's in Birmingham. So if they're nearby, it's something they can travel to. Whereas if they're in Antarctica, they probably might not care about it as much. And if they're not interested in digital marketing, that's perfectly fine. But the sooner they understand that, the less time they have to waste on our story and find a story that they're more interested in. But if I infuse every tweet with the essence of what our story is, the more likely that people will pick up on that story very quickly. And they can either draw themselves in more or move on to the next thing. If we took blogs instead, and I like blogs because I've been blogging for 11 years at this point. And again, a little bit more like publishing, something I'm familiar with. But I write every day on blogs that I own, and I've worked on client blogs and so on. But if I were to tell a brand story over the course of a year, like for Y'all Connect, I think it'd take probably 100 posts. That's 2 posts a week. Right now, I'm probably writing 1 to 1.5 posts a week on average. So I'm not even meeting my own standard for telling a story.
I wasn't going to say that.
But let's say I did write 2 posts a week, and you happen to follow the blog. Are you going to see all 100 posts? No. I mean, if I'm lucky, you might see 3 or 4 over the course of 52 weeks. I could pay everyone in this room cash, and you wouldn't read all 100 posts. But I know you'd read a couple of them because, one post is going to be about some of the speakers, and another post is going to be about their topics. And, if you're actually considering going, you want to know what they're going to talk about and see if it meets what you're trying to learn about. And another post might be about, some sale on tickets or something, because people want to save money on the event. And then you might just randomly stumble upon a couple of more. But I'm trying to tell a story on my blog, and everyone's coming in the middle of that story all the time. It's like if 10 of you just walked into the middle of this presentation right now and tried to make heads or tails out of what I was saying based on the rest of it. It's just hard to maintain a coherent narrative.
I was going to say, one thing that I've seen is if people are making a series of posts that all link back to each other, they will actively link them to each other. And I wondered if that was something you thought was that an audience would be willing to do. versus just sitting here and reading the one story, or, oh, hey, up here at the top they say if you really want to know the full story, click and read this one first. Do you think people actually go back and do that? Do you think that's viable?
So our question is, when you're posting online, whether it's a blog or a media publication or news updates, sometimes you'll see promos for related material, different parts of a series or same topic, or interviews with people within that feature story or whatever. Do I think it works as keeping people on site and getting to, yeah, that's something that you're doing as a service to the reader. Is random reader comes in through a Google search or through a friend's Facebook link or whatever. They don't know what your publication is. They don't know who the writer is. They just saw the headline or the photo and wanted to read more. And if you're thinking ahead about what that reader would need beyond that story, you have the option to link to related material on the site. You can also take advantage of plugins and software that automatically generate related links as well. But your goal in that instance is to make sure they get as complete a story as possible. And if you guide them along the way, that's useful, that's helpful. That means that you're thinking about the reader and the audience. You don't have to do that in the book. When you pick up a book, there's a table of contents, plus people tend to read from beginning to end. You don't have to do that with a movie. If I make a movie for you, typically you show up at the beginning of the movie and you just watch it beginning to end. The narrative that I create in those media is mimicked in the experience that all the audience members have. But in blogging, every single person comes to that blog at a different point in the story. And some of the people skim the headline and then move on. Some people read the headline and skim the first paragraph and then move on. Some people skim through the story and then move on. Some people read through the story once or twice. Or they'll click on another story. Or they'll navigate through your site to find out more information. But if everybody's doing something different, how do I tell the story of my brand in some coherent fashion? It's like if I wrote each post on a stack of index cards, threw them in the air randomly, and expected each of you to get the same experience by picking up one postcard, one index card at random, and trying to understand the overall story. Again, with each blog post, I have to infuse it with the brand story in that one sentence, in that one word. It's not just useful for making sure that your colleagues are on the same page. It's helpful in guiding readers to helping understand more quickly what your story is about and whether or not they should come along for the ride. One other example from social media might be Instagram, photo sharing network. How do I tell the story of Y'all Connect in photos? I'm a writer. I am not a photographer. And I appreciate the set of skills that photographers have. When we tell the story of Y'all Connect in photos, we use photos from a professional photographer. But that only talks about one day of the event. How do I sustain a narrative over the course of a year? Because in 12 months, I think it'd take about 1,000 photos to do it properly. It's about 3 photos a day. That's more than the average Instagram user. But if I want to capture your attention, that's the volume of output I've got to do. So, one way to do it is to talk about Birmingham, because Birmingham is my home. Birmingham is the home of our event. And one of our goals is not just to bring people to our event. That'd be nice. But really, if people come to Birmingham for business, for pleasure, to visit people, that's a win for us, because we want to show off Birmingham to the wider world. If they come to our conference, that's great, but there's also 364 days a year that the conference doesn't take place. And so by showing off Birmingham in those photos, that helps tell a different part of our narrative, but one that's important to our story, because we were founded here. This is where we are. This is the place that we want to show off to the world. But you can see that one of the challenges in picking the channel that you're going to reach your audience on is not just figuring out if the audience is there and how they get their information. It's telling a story that makes sense in such a fractured space. Because again, it's not like a book, it's not like a movie, it's a series of posts, it's a series of updates, it's a series of videos, it's a series of photos. And everybody's going to have a different experience. The only chance you have of bringing them into the narrative is to make sure each piece of it is permeated with your brand story. So channel is one aspect to look at. The next aspect is voice. And that probably doesn't require a lot of explanation for this audience. I mean, typically you're either going to see one singular institutional voice representing a brand, or you might see multiple voices representing different departments or people or personalities of the brand. There's no right answer. You know, an organization that's trying out one singular voice can always switch to multiple voices. If they start out with multiple voices, they can switch to a singular voice. But the you know, people understand and pick up on voice. You know, if they read a bunch of stories from the New York Times, whether they read it in print or on the app or on the website, they'd recognize a shared institutional voice. Same if they read from the Huffington Post or from the Wall Street Journal or from BuzzFeed. You know, as a reporter and editor, you know, I understand writing in the style of the institutional voice. But companies have different approaches to how they do their voice on social media, on blogging, on email, and so on. But you just want to consider how voice plays into how your story is perceived, how you tell that story, and how you attract people to your brand. You know, is it better to have that one singular voice? Is it better to have multiple voices that reflect the brand? Channel, voice, the last part is brand. Brand is tricky because it's like a two-sided coin. On one side of that coin, it's what you're trying to put out there for people to consume. Apple is a good example. Apple spends millions of dollars on branding. TV commercials, events, product packaging, Apple stores, even the t-shirts that their employees wear, even the device around their neck where they swipe your credit card. All of that is part of their branding. Putting in all those little details into their look, their colors, their logo, their design. But the other side of the coin is perception. How do we perceive that brand? Apple may want to be perceived as hip and cutting edge and modern and luxurious and worth it. But if our perception is they're overpriced, or they're unreliable, or they're hipsterish, or if we come away with some negative connotation, they've got a disconnect on their hands, and that's a real problem. It means that no matter how much they spend on their branding, it's not working. And the thing that I want you to consider about brand is your company has spent some time and money and effort on coming up with a brand that represents their organization and the audience they're trying to reach. That brand plays out differently with each online platform that you're using. Your website's a good example. If I go to your website and it's easy to use and I can find the information I need and it's up to date and on my phone screen it's easy to get around, that's great. That means it's easy for you to tell your story and it represents your brand well. However, if I go to your website and it's broken and there are missing links and missing photos and hasn't been updated in a while, and I can't pull it up on my phone or tablet, that's a big problem because it's showing off an aspect of your brand that you probably didn't intend to be out there. And it's interfering with your storytelling because the moment I hit that website, I'm going to leave. I'm not going to sit there and try and fight it. I'm just going to give up and go find someone else who can help me with that problem or information. Same with Facebook pages. You know, lots of companies have Facebook pages, and you know, if I go to the Facebook page and I find that there are stories and updates and replies to people's comments, and it's timely and it's interesting, that's a good sign. They're maintaining their Facebook page, they care about their brand, and it shows that they're involved. But if I go to the Facebook page and the last update was 3 months ago, and there are lots of people asking simple questions or complaining and no one responds to them, that's showing off what their brand is too, and it's a terrible brand story. And it's not the story that you want to put out there. I was talking to a group of editors last week, and you know, I was running through their assets, you know, website and blogs and video pages and Facebook page and Twitter account and Google Plus page. And at that point, all the editors like, leaned forward, because they didn't know they had a Google Plus page. Someone had set it up for them though, this wasn't some auto-generated page.
Oh gosh.
But that didn't surprise me, because the last time that someone had updated that page was 2 years ago. But that's a reflection of their brand too. And so the challenge that you have as storytellers is, not only what channels do you pick to put out there, but how does it reflect your brand? Is the effort being made to ensure that those digital outposts are up to date and reflective of your brand? Because if they're not, you either have to get rid of them or find a way to maintain them. But it can interfere with your storytelling message if the brand feels wrong. Because remember, people don't automatically go to your website to get information. A lot of people just pull it up the Facebook page on their phone. And that is their only interaction with your brand. Which means the impression you make there will make or break what you're trying to do. So in how to tell your story, consider channel, consider voice, consider brand on how you reach your audiences. The last area that I want to cover is how to monetize your digital storytelling. And as promised at the beginning, there are 3 questions that you need to ask yourself so that you can change your focus, so that you can adapt to the audience's needs. Because by default, we tend to think of the revenue stream as advertising. I create some content and there's an ad with it, or a pop-up, or a pre-roll, or something that goes with it. That is one form of monetization, but it is not the only form out there. But in order to get to that point, let's look at 3 questions that can help you with this. The first question is, are your fans hanging on every word? Is your story compelling? You have to think about what your audience cares about, what interests them, what will capture their attention. Fortunately, as professionals, you understand that need to be compelling. But it's a need that's growing all the time, because from the moment we get up in the morning, we have competition for our attention. There's noise, there's spam, there's text messages, there's Facebook, there are emails. You might flip on the TV or the radio or streaming music. There's information, there are traffic updates, there's news, there are pop-up ads, there are audio ads, there are commercials. You get out the door, there are billboards, there are signs. You get to work, there are interruptions from coworkers, there's more email, there are voice messages to return, there are text messages to return. This is what's cluttering our field of vision. And within that field of vision, you have to stand out. You have to be more interesting than the 1,000 other distractions out there. It's not a fair playing field, but that's the hand that we're dealt. Are your fans hanging on every single word? Has to be a starting point, because if you go in looking to create compelling content, whether they are blog posts, whether they are news stories, whether they are tweets or Facebook updates or Instagram posts or snaps on Snapchat, you at least start to have a fighting chance to bring in that audience. The second question, are your fans helping to create the narrative? That's tough to say as a writer. I've been writing my whole life, and I like being able to have full control over the narrative. I went into publishing. I write the story, we print it in the newspaper, you may or may not read it, but that's it. If you're mad or happy, you can call me or you can complain to your friends, but you can't change what's in the newspaper. But in blogging, in interactive media, on Twitter, on Facebook, we have the opportunity to involve others in the story. We don't have to treat it as a broadcast medium. With Y'all Connect, we're this conference that just brings speakers and put them on stage and they talk about digital marketing. That could be the end of the story. But the more interesting version is our guests and our fans and our potential audience members tell us who should be on that stage, what they want to learn about, what challenges do they face in marketing that we might be able to help them with. And it's up to me to not just listen to them and then just brush them off, but to take their input and weave it into the next chapter, to make sure that we take their suggestions, that we put them on stage, that we get topics that reflect their needs. and what they're trying to figure out, and to make sure that they understand that they are helping write the story through feedback, through tweets, through surveys, through posts, through recounts, through ticket sales. They are part of telling that story. That's difficult for us as storytellers because we're ceding control, at least some of it, to a wide audience out there. But we're doing it all the time. When we interact with people, when we interact with brands and companies, when we complain about a store being closed 5 minutes before we got there, or lousy customer service, or some other issue, the question is that brand paying attention? Is that brand trying to make their story better, or are we just white noise on the periphery? So are your fans hanging on every word? Are they helping write the narrative? Third question, who is the real star of the story? I worked in journalism for a long period of time, but I also helped with marketing efforts for the publications and media outlets that I worked for. And I've worked in a lot of marketing for clients and other organizations since then. So the star of the story is easy. It's my company, it's my brand, it's my products and services. It's us. That's the default answer of a marketer. It's the wrong answer. The star of the story is you, the fans, the audience. Because if I tell you a story about how our company is so great because we work so hard and we're better than everyone else and you're going to love our products and services, you already know the end of that story because you've heard that story 1,000 times. And it always ends the same way, with me. That's not a very interesting story. In fact, most of you tune out that story many, many times a day. If the real star of the story is the audience, if we can learn to keep our egos at the door, they at least have some buy-in. They at least recognize who's in the story. They have stakes. They have a vested interest in the outcome. I love Y'all Connect. I could talk about it all day. I think it's a fantastic event. But the real star of that story isn't me starting it a few years ago by myself and what we did since then. It's the hundreds of people that spend their time with us to learn and to network and to understand marketing better and to talk with our speakers and to talk with each other. And it's those folks who are struggling with marketing and are trying to figure out their resources and how to reach these different audiences and what to do differently than before that's going to pay off now and in the long term. The better I understand them as characters, the better I understand them as the hero of my story, the better we can collaborate on some solution, something that will help them triumph in the end. But it's difficult because, again, as a writer of many years, I'm ceding control of the story. And I'm having to think about a different protagonist. It's easy to think about our company, our products or services, our colleagues as the heroes, because we know them so well. We work with them all the time, and we know them forwards and backwards. But they're not as interesting a story as we think they are. The real star of the story has to be the audience you're trying to reach. Only then can you create a compelling narrative. Only then can you hope to bring them in the fold, because they'll actually recognize themselves in the story. They'll recognize that struggle that they're dealing with. So, are your fans hanging on every word? Are they helping shape the narrative? Who is the real star of the story? I ask these questions because I want you to think about your focus in telling stories in the digital world. And by bringing the audience in, when they become invested in your narrative, when they start to explore your story deeper, when they look at your website and call you for more information or email you or seek out what you do and how they can purchase your products or services or work with you, that's the different way to monetize it, beyond just banner ads and pop-up ads.
And there's something else you do, Wade, that actually touched me.
Mm-hmm.
Is that when I started following Wade and I went to Y'all Connect and I tweeted some things from Y'all Connect, because I can encourage you to do that with their hashtag, I got personal tweets with my Twitter handle, thanks, writer Jeannie, for the shout out or whatever. So all of a sudden I felt like I was part of Wade's team. I felt like Wade knew who I was. So that's how he made me want to follow him more, made me want to connect with him more. That gets back to your question. How do you reach these people? You directly tweet them. And you may not see it, Twitter is part of that's how you reach business people.
First of all, thank you, Jeannie, that's very kind of you, I appreciate it.
It's sincere.
Well, and I mean, we can't do it without our guests. And so when I write these stories, I have to make that effort to keep you and all of our other guests in mind in terms of what are you working on, what are you trying to figure out? Because you have so many resources and options at your disposal. If you have questions and I don't get a chance to answer them today, my contact information on the postcard. I've got an email address and Twitter handle on there. Feel free to contact me because as you take on some of these challenges, you might not have the question today, but it may come to you tomorrow or next week or next year. Feel free to ask. Because as you can see, I'm happy to talk about storytelling at length. And I wanted to squeeze in as much as we could today, but you may come up with some other questions down the road. Feel free to reach out to me. So you understand that with digital storytelling, it's important because there's an opportunity there to reach audiences and to understand them better, to fine-tune the stories that you're putting out there. You define your story and you define it succinctly. You determine how you want to tell it through looking at channel, voice, and brand. And you ask yourself those 3 questions so you can figure out the best way to monetize that story, to go beyond the default of just advertising as a revenue stream. But this gives you the opportunity to take your natural storytelling skills and to become digital storytellers, to expand your audience, to improve your outreach, to further your goals for yourself and for your company so that everyone can live happily ever after.